So the truth is, I've always read romance. Always. Ever since I was a teenager. And I might go into that in a little bit, depending on how this rant goes. But I didn't always admit that I read it. And that's pretty interesting to me for a number of reasons. And as I've gotten more and more hyped for Bridgerton, and I've been public about my hype for Bridgerton, I've had other female friends share with me that they too are excited for Bridgerton, but that I'm the only person that they've told about this. They are also hiding their love for romance and, this series, yes, but I suspect more broadly because I did it too. Romance, sex, sexuality, sensuality, and fiction are all in and of themselves intense and really, really interesting topics. And I think that every person who approaches their own unique cocktail of intersection of that has their own unique take on the subject. But in my old age, I've realized that my personal cocktail of sex, sensuality, sexuality, fiction, romance, my sense of the erotic, is pretty basic, which is a humbling thing to admit. Everyone likes to think they're special, but I didn't always think it was. And I spent a significant portion of my life viewing myself as deviant, which again, in my old age, I realize I'm not. But I spent years thinking I was. And then I spent years being ashamed of very, very basic human desires and utterly lacking the language to talk about them and communicate with them in healthy ways, which, as you might expect, had an impact on my relationships. And more than that, I spent a lot of time even after that, having done the work to unpick and unpack and do the reshaping required to own my own feelings in my adulthood, still not quite outrunning the sense of shame or guilt that I had around the topics, which is weird. Why is liking something as innocuous as a popular Netflix series a source of shame or guilt, or in the best context, guilty pleasures, but still guilty? And why are we like this? Why can't we just be normal? Everyone's answer to that is going to be different. But again, I think mine is more common. My answer is more common than I want to admit. And for all of the years that I've been thinking about it, that I've been in therapy about it, that I've been enjoying fiction of this type, that I have been actively encouraging other people, mostly but not exclusively women, to enjoy fiction of this type and to just like the things that they like and to be okay with how they feel, I've actually been pretty bad at it myself. And I've been really bad at expressing why, or unpicking why, or talking about it. And even for the last few months, as I've been trying to do more and more work in the creative space, this topic has been on my list of things to talk about, and I haven't been brave enough to do it, or I haven't been able to set aside the time to do it, or I don't know where to start with it. So we're just gonna word vomit all over the internet and see what happens. Strap in. So I remember a few pivotal personal experiences with romance fiction writ large. And I want to talk about them, and then I want to contextualize the wider conversation in which I was receiving them. So I remember two specific experiences with romance novels painted with a broad brush that happened when I was in my teens that stand out to me to this day. One of them was my experience with the book Memoirs of a Geisha. This is a far from perfect novel for a lot of cultural reasons, but it was a very popular novel and it was a very influential novel. And maybe this is problematic, but it's a novel that I really enjoyed in a lot of ways. I remember the first time I interacted with this novel. I must have been about 13 years old, and I remember taking it off our family's bookshelves, just looking for something to read because my family has always owned tons and tons of books. We were a military family growing up, and you know, whenever we would PCS or move from place to place, usually country to country, there's always a limit of what you can carry with you as a family. You have a literal weight allowance. And ours was always dominated by the sheer amount of books that our family had, which I'm not mad about. I think it was good for us. But I remember going to this bookshelf and I remember noticing that book and taking it down and looking at it. And I also remember my mother going, I don't think you'd enjoy that very much. It's not for you right now. And because I was a very dutiful, good, well-behaved kid, we'll get into that later, don't you worry, I didn't think about it too much. And I went, oh, okay. And I put it on the shelf and I got a different book. A couple of years later, though, in a totally different house, on a totally different continent, I had an almost identical experience. I was looking for something to read and I went to the family bookshelves and I pulled it down. I must have been 15 or 16 at this point. And I remember looking at the cover and just being struck by the image of it, which was a very beautiful paperback cover of based on a photograph of a geisha from, must have been the 1930s or 40s. And my mother going, oh, that's a really good book. I think you'd like that. And this triggered my memory. And I went, didn't you say that I wouldn't like this before? And she went, yeah, but you're older now. I think you can handle it. And I could. There are frank discussions of sexuality and sensuality in the book. It's a whole aspect of the plot and the character development, which is not correct in terms of geisha, geiko, and maiko training as I understand it, and we know better now, but it is an element of the actual novel and the character journey of the main character, Sayuri. And I really enjoyed the book. Like I said, I still do. But that dichotomy of my mother describing the same book to me as inappropriate at one stage in my life and something I would really enjoy at another has always stuck out to me. That's experience number one. Experience number two. In one of our many family moves, my family moved from the east coast of the United States to the island of Guam in the middle of the Pacific. And I stayed behind because I was attending a playwriting and theater camp and experience, and I was going to be catching up with them a couple months down the line. So I must have been 15 at the time, and spent the summer at the Theater of Virginia's camp, had a great time. It was a wonderful experience. And on the multi-stage journey to get from the east coast of the United States to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I was in an airport bookstore and I was looking for something to read. And I was intrigued by a cover of a book that I found in one of those airport bookstores. And it was a romance novel. I think the title was something like The Duchess, or, proper bodice ripping territory. It's a bit cringe in retrospect. But I just remember liking the illustration on the cover and kind of thinking to myself, I have a lot of questions about sex and sexuality and how people experience it, so let's read a book about it. Again, put a pin in it. We'll come back to this, I promise. And it wasn't a particularly good book, as memory serves, but it was interesting and it was, slightly titillating in that casual airport bookstore romance kind of way. And I didn't really think anything about it. I read it on the flight and then just chucked it in a drawer somewhere. A few months later, though, my mom spotted it on my bookshelf or in my room somewhere. And she was really, really weirded out by it. And she confronted me because she saw the cover and she obviously knew that we were dealing with a bodice ripper here. And she asked me why I had it. And I said, oh, I just found it, at the airport. And I just was intrigued. And she kind of chastised me. And she said, do you think this was a really appropriate thing for you to read? And I said, I guess not. Even though I couldn't really entirely articulate why. And, I felt shamed and I felt guilty, like I had done something wrong. But I also remember saying, well, I was just kind of curious about it. I'd never read a book like that before. And to my mom's credit, her response, calmed down a little bit. And she said, okay, but I don't think this is a good thing to read. And I really don't want it in the house. And I said, oh, okay, backed away slowly. And we never talked about it again. She threw it out. Those were my two experiences with romance novels until I was 15 years old. Other than that, my exposure to sex and sensuality and sexuality was pretty strictly limited. And there's a reason for that. So, we need to talk about Mormonism. Everybody's had some kind of experience, I'm sure, with Mormon communities or some pop culture engagement with them, and that it's a whole long story. But for those of you who don't know, I was raised Mormon. Both of my parents are still practicing Mormons. One of my siblings is still practicing. Two of my other siblings and I have all left the faith. I am not a believer. I don't practice. I'm not associated or affiliated with the Mormon community in any way. And yet, I catch myself all the time referring to myself colloquially as Mormon because Mormonism doesn't wash off. It is a high demand religion. It asks a lot of its followers, and it influences, not to say dictates, a lot of the life of its followers. For those who don't know, there are very strict regulations around dietary laws and behavioral laws, and pretty strict limitations around sex and sexuality. And these are heavily, heavily gendered. I am far from the first or the most articulate person to point this out, but for a lot of more conservative Western, Judeo-Christian derived or adjacent faiths, the ideas around sexual purity tend to be heavily gendered anyway, and Mormonism is no different. Where Mormonism kind of goes a little bit down its own track, however, is the emphasis that it places on sex and sexuality, because Mormonism is doctrinally inherently gendered. They believe in an embodied God who has a designated sex and gender. They believe that sex and gender are characteristics that perpetuate through the eternities. And they believe in a biological aspect of the religion in the formation and structure of families. So if you've ever thought, wow, Mormons are really into nuclear families, at least in this century, yeah, there's a reason for that. The patriarchal order of Mormonism is that there is a spiritual head of the family in a cis man married to a cis woman monogamously, again this century, and building a family together biologically. This is literally the most important thing in Mormonism, and it is drilled into culturally and doctrinally from a very, very young age. Spiritual purity is a huge element of this, and sex and sexuality is very much presented, organized, controlled, and understood within this monogamous, heteronormative, strict gender-rolled organization. This is the correct way of doing things. And the way that young people in particular are taught about sex tends to be weirdly negative. And this is a dichotomy that a lot of people, myself included, experienced growing up, where many conflicting ideas are true at the same time. On the one hand, sex is good and natural and normal. It is the way that you will bond with your future spouse and the way that you will create children. And on the other hand, sex is a threat. If you're a woman, it's something that threatens you. If you're a man, it's something that must be controlled within you. A lot of metaphors are used, particularly in approaching the youth, so young adults, in explaining and teaching about sexuality. Women in particular are often presented with object lessons in Sunday schools about sexual purity, where you are presented with a stick of gum. And if you have sex, the gum becomes chewed and therefore less worthwhile. I remember one lesson where someone brought in like a plank of wood and nailed a bunch of nails into it and used the idea of repentance and forgiveness of sin, of pulling out the nails from the board, but that the holes left by the nails were still in there, which in retrospect feels a little doctrinally unsound, but I cannot stress enough how this idea of being a cupcake that's been licked by a lot of people, or a stick of gum that's been chewed by multiple people, or a board that's had a lot of nails drilled into it, means that sex outside of the right boundaries is defiling. It is bad. It's corrupting, and you can never quite get over it. Now, obviously, I'm not male, and the genders are heavily segregated within Mormonism from a very young age. From about 12 years old, young women start to attend Sunday school classes that are geared to them, and young men start to attend classes that are geared to them. And the messages that boys and girls receive are not exactly the same. A lot of the same object lessons apply, but they're somewhat different in tone from what I understand anecdotally and what I've read and researched since. Girls, we're at risk of becoming the licked cupcake, if you will. But boys are really taught about their own sexual drives as being animalistic or something to be controlled. The consumption of porn is a really big topic in Mormonism when it comes to men in particular. And at least when I was growing up and into my young adulthood, I remember so many sermons and lectures and organized teaching from, the central messaging components of the church to men specifically about porn and how perverted it was and how perverting it was. And I also remember from university age and on having male friends who were convinced that they were porn addicts because they watched it sometimes, or they had watched it when they were 12 or 13 or something, and they lived with the shame of it for a really long time. I do not remember, however, ever receiving a lesson about porn geared towards girls, because, as the great and good Natalie Wynn recently put in her most recent video,
I realize here I'm stepping into a vicious debate that's been going on for decades about the difference between romance and erotica. What is the difference between romance and erotica? I got so curious about this that I actually contacted the English departments of Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, and I was surprised that they pretty much all agreed on a definition that romance is for good girls and erotica is for sluts. Pornography, of course, is for men.
Erotica wasn't a thing that I really understood existed, and porn, as I understood it, was a visual medium that was geared to and for men and made them bad or worse in some way. Romance as a genre wasn't even really on my radar until I started looking for it in my early teens. It wasn't something that was available to me, it wasn't something that was acknowledged, and it wasn't something that I had access to. And all of my cultural references about things that were erotic, explicitly sexual in nature, very much came with the lens, through the lens rather, that they were for men. That's pretty interesting. Now, so that is a small fragment of the the narrative world in which I was raised. But it's not as easy as that. There's more complexities. Because for all of that cultural language that I had and that I was raised in and I inherited, I also had pretty sex positive parents. I remember getting the talk when I was a kid from my parents and sex being presented to me as something that was good, that parents, because again, it was very much presented in the context of this is something married couples do with each other. Cool. But they did it because it felt good and they loved each other and it was a positive thing. And someday I would experience it and wouldn't that be great? But not now, not yet. I had to experience it in the right way. So there were caveats presented, but the message from my parents directly at the time was all things considered, and particularly in the context of all of these competing or contrasting Mormon messages, was pretty sex positive overall, asterisks. And I know that my experience was not typical, at least, again, anecdotally. I'm sure there's many more studies out there. There's some brilliant Mormon scholars and scholars of Mormonism that have looked into this. I'm sure you can find them if you Google. But anecdotally, growing up and having conversations about sex and sexuality with female friends, I realized that my parents' framing to me as sex as being a positive thing was not the universal experience, not by a long shot. And again, it was at odds with the bulk of the other cultural messaging that I was receiving from the church community, and again, the dearth of content that I wasn't receiving from other areas because, my parents, which is their right, I guess, were very, very strict about controlling the kinds of media that entered the home and that we were exposed to. I think all parents, regardless of your personal or religious views, have to struggle with this. I don't really blame them for this. But though I didn't realize that at the time, I was already dealing with some of these conflicting messages. And other girls that I knew were too. And I don't even think this is just a Mormonism issue. Again, for a lot of Western Judeo-Christian derived or adjacent religions in hyper-religious spaces, I think there's often this unique combination of foundational problems when it comes to sex and sexuality. I found, and I didn't have the language to express this at the time, it's only, in subsequent years that I've been able to put it together, but I find Mormon culture aggressively sexless while also obsessed with sexuality. And these two things being true at the same time is kind of a mindfuck. Now, because of that emphasis that I mentioned, particularly on marriage and on pair bonding, again, broadly speaking, Mormon culture tends to romanticize relationships. I remember growing up, so many sermons and lessons where leaders, local all the way up the food chain, would refer to their partners in very, very sweet and loving terms. And I think this is important, I was almost always hearing men refer to their partners because Mormon leadership is deeply patriarchal. And I remember, again, in my youth, there was a real trend of male leaders talking about their sweethearts, which in isolation is adorable and is great. I would like to do an entirely different video rant about how much I like and think we need more of in media Depictions of partners who like each other. I think, unironically, this is a big aspect of why romance is so popular, because it's nice to see partnerships that are functional or aspirational, or again, wherein the partners like each other. I don't want to go on a tangent too badly here, but it is amazing to me how much media there is that depicts partners who don't like each other or who resent one another. It is refreshing and lovely and deeply, deeply appealing, again, broadly speaking, I think for women, to see depictions of men who like the women in their lives. It's more rare than you'd think. Anyway, lovely, right? It was lovely. But sex was very obliquely referenced, if ever it was, and almost entirely in negative ways. It was fear-based and shame-based for girls. The chewed gum or the licked cupcake. There's kind of an infamous statement from a church leader who cautioned young women against becoming pornography for men by dressing provocatively, which is quite literally a textbook example of objectification, but whatever. That was the message to girls. And to men and boys, there's a real sense of constraint that centered on contempt and self-loathing. You're animals, you can't control yourself. You are more likely to use porn. How dare you? This is gross and this is bad. And as for sexuality, the many, many expressions of human desire or pleasure, they were almost never referred to. And if they were, it was almost always in a sense of discouragement, something to be tamed or controlled or explicitly avoided until suddenly, you got married and it was all systems go. And I am far from the first person to comment that 0 to 60 approach of sexuality does a lot of harm. But for the most formative years of most young people's lives, sex and sexuality and sensuality is not incorporated into people's thinking. The lessons you hear about it are all about rejection and avoidance and containment. It doesn't even stop there. Think about, if you're not Mormon, one of the reasons you've probably heard about the church in most recent years, particularly if you're American, has to do with its political input. And that political input has been almost solely about restricting or curtailing sexuality, gender expression, organization of marriage in ways that they don't like. If it's non-heteronormative or nuclear, they are against it. And the church has infamously at this point leveraged huge amount of resources into corralling, curtailing, or fighting anything that's not that. In other words, within Mormonism, to get to the point after a very long time, sexuality is almost entirely defined by what we don't do. In other words, Mormonism makes room for sex in its teaching, again, in the idea that you have to construct a pair bonding and a nuclear family, and there is an unavoidable biological element to this. But it doesn't really make room for sexuality. And that result, sex without sexuality, is really bad. It's really unhealthy. Equally for men and women, but I think slightly in different ways, broadly speaking. Sex without lust, sex without eroticism, sex without pleasure, that's just mechanics. That's IKEA instructions of inserting tab A into slot B. And okay, if that's what scratches your particular itch, great, go. But zoomed out, I don't think that that's a recipe for success over broader populations. And for women in particular, who, again, in a very generalistic way, I think our sexuality tends to be slightly broader or more complex, that doesn't produce a particularly enjoyable experience. And this weird sense that sex positive and sexuality negative are supposed to exist at the same time is deeply weird and dysfunctional, and it produces a lot of problems. So this is all very interesting. Welcome to your internal psychology, C. I hear you saying, what does this have to do with romance? So again, growing up, I was swimming in these weird messages about sex and sexuality, where I was told on the one hand that it was a normal, healthy, good, pleasurable thing, but also to avoid it at all costs and it would damage me. This provoked a lot of curiosity on my part, which is why I ended up looking for information about sex in a way that felt safe and controlled. I wasn't going to go out and have it because that would hurt me or ruin me in some way, but I still wanted to know about it, which I think is a very normal, typical pubescent teenager experience. I remember writing in my diary at one point, feeling embarrassed that I was curious about sex because I wasn't supposed to be, but I was, and I didn't know what to do about it. Enter the romance genre. Romance as a genre is multifaceted. It's varied. If you're interested in it, someone writes about it. But I've already described my first two forays into the romance genre. One, in a kind of controlled and sanctioned way, one in a curious kind of way that was met with weird kind of feedback and resistance. And then from that point, I would actively seek out romance, but I wouldn't talk about it. I read it in the library. I read it in school. I found examples of it. Public libraries are fantastic. Highly recommend. I remember going into bookstores, and from the time I was about 15 or 16, I would read romance. And I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't mention it. I didn't bring it up. Nobody knew, and I would never have acknowledged it if I had been asked. It was far from the only genre that I read. I like to think I'm a very, very wide-read person, but it was very much something that I didn't acknowledge or talk about. Fast forward all of these years later, I decided to stop being ashamed of it, to see what would happen. And those Goodreads reading challenges that you can sign up for? I think it must have been about 2021, where I just decided, you know what, I'm reading these books and I'm not marking them on Goodreads because I'm embarrassed, I'm ashamed. What if I'm judged? What if people think I'm déclassé? What if people think I'm less intelligent? What if I'm dismissed for being a woman who likes women's literature, the horror? I decided, no, I'm just gonna add it to Goodreads when I read something. Number one, my reading counts went up a lot because I can get through a murder mystery or a romance novel pretty much in a single setting. So smashed my reading goals. Feels pretty good. And number two, literally nothing else happened. No one has ever commented on my reading. No one has ever judged me for my reading. No one has sought out me to confront me about it. Literally, no one cares. And that is both liberating and weirdly humbling. I think when you come to terms with your own sense of sexuality and sensuality, everyone has to go through a process of figuring out what they like in terms of reality with partners, figuring out what they like in terms of fantasy, i.e. what gets their gears going in their own head. Everyone has to figure out where those lines are between those two things, because a lot of the stuff people like to write or read are not the things that they're at all interested in doing in real life. Again, ContraPoints' latest video on this is really, really good at breaking down the difference between wish fulfillment fantasy worlds wherein you're experiencing and satisfying an emotional need or itch versus something that you actually want in the real world. They're sometimes the same thing, but not always. And I think that in romance fiction, again, really, really broadly, with all of the possible caveats, like any other genre, it's about knowing what the end result is going to be and enjoying the process of getting there anyway. With a murder mystery, you know that you're gonna figure out who killed who and why. That's always the end result. Hercule Poirot is always going to gather everyone together in the library, and he's always going to confront every single character as to why they're a suspect, and then, humiliate them somewhat in front of the rest of the cast before dismissing them. No, it is not you, but you, mon ami, j'accuse. And it's always satisfying when it does. And the romance genre is no different. There is almost always, again, genre variation, whatever, but there's always a happy ending. A conflict, an emotional confrontation is overcome, and two people, find happiness together. Most of romance genre is very, very internal. It is mostly about internal conflicts, people who have to overcome an emotional barrier or past trauma or personal prejudice or experience to get to a happy result. And isn't that all any human being wants in the end, really? It's nice, it's fun. And the best romance writers are people who can write the same stories, the same tropes over and over again, but make you care about each pair or group of people in a new way. They make each character unique or interesting. Sometimes you relate to them. Sometimes you don't relate to them because the characters are wildly different from you. But the process of seeing another character, another person evolve and change in ways that are good for them feels good. It feels emotionally satisfying. And again, I cannot stress enough how much media doesn't portray this. Think of a lot of your elite, appointment television. I loved Succession. I love it. I think it's some of the best TV that's been produced in years. And yet none of the characters really end up in a different place from where they started. That's because, in many ways, Succession is a tragedy. You know what you're getting into. You know what you're signed up for. The joy and the pleasure of experiencing that is seeing how the characters do, or in some cases don't, evolve along the way. That's all any kind of genre fiction is, and in some respect, all fiction falls into some genre or other. We might know what the end result is, but it's the twists, the turns, the subversion of expectations, or in some cases, the really, really satisfying payoffs of even well-established tropes that are so, so satisfying. In a lot of media that is geared to women, or is about women, or features women, it's not always produced for the female gaze, is it? It is largely about women, women as tropes, or women as characters, but not always about us as women, or as in ways that go into our wants and needs as individuals or people. That's one of the troubles with fiction stroke all genre fiction. And that's okay. You have to learn to enjoy that. And well-designed, well-written characters will always be appealing. Even the ones that we're supposed to root against. Like, how many people are more interested in villains these days than the heroes? I mean, guilty. But with romance, again, you know where you're going to end up. The pleasure is in how you get there. The Bridgerton series of Netflix is based on books that are 20-something years old. They are well established in the romance canon. The pleasure in watching is in how you get there. The costumes are fun. The artistic design is fun. But they're deeply human stories, and they're about mostly the inner lives of its characters. And I cannot stress this enough. They're about people who like women. I mean, broadly speaking, we're talking about heterosexual relationships, not exclusively, but okay, whatever. To have characters, male characters, unabashedly like the women in their lives is so appealing. It's so nice. It's so pleasant. It's so rare. And I can't help but feel in the current age in which we live, in which women are losing access to abortion rights, in which women and our anger and our rage is being thrown back in our faces with things like Harvey Weinstein's, one of his convictions being overturned, the whole of the Trump presidency, the rise of the trad wife movement, as opposed to the conflict between work and family friendly policies. A lot of the world is still incredibly hostile to women and the female experience, whether or not it's intentional or malicious being beside the point. But to watch and experience things where women are liked and desired and respected and lusted after and enjoyed and appreciated, like all of these things can be true at the same time. But very few genres actually encompass those things and that breadth of experience. And the one that does it the best, in my opinion, is romance. And I'm personally delighted to see more and more people unabashedly standing the things that they like. I am so pleased anytime one of my female friends responds to one of my silly stories or comments saying, oh my goodness, I really, really love this series too. I'm so excited about this character. I want to see what happens. I love it when people own the things they like. And having grown up in a culture where I did not feel able to like sex and sexuality and sensuality, except in very specific ways, most of which were off limits to me at the time I was learning about them. Learning to enjoy eroticism and fantasy and sensuality and sexuality has been an important thing. It's been a journey that I appreciate, and one that I couldn't have accomplished for most of my life except through the lens of fiction. I've learned a lot through romance. The first positive depiction of a gay relationship I ever read was via fiction. The first example of positive sexual experiences that I ever engaged with were fiction. They were through romance. The first and best depictions of active consent that I ever read about, that I ever saw portrayed, was via romance fiction. I think a lot of people want to do a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of gatekeeping, a lot of constraining about sex and sexuality and sensuality. I think they especially want to do it for women and girls. And if that's what you think, okay, I'm probably not going to change your mind. But I'm really, really sad to see how much of it organizes itself around romance and female-coded fiction. The things that women like, or the things that we like to watch or to read. It's seen as dangerous, and it's seen that way in a way that, again, in my personal experience, was not even analogous to men and pornography. Men were cautioned against pornography. I was never even told romance existed. That's weird, right? And yet, I learned so much about positive sexuality and sensuality, even though I was not sexually active myself until my 20s. And romance has given me a lens to explore ideas about sexuality and sensuality, and to learn about all different kinds of pairings, about all different kinds of behaviors in ways that I would never have personally been exposed to, and frankly, don't wish to explore myself in non-judgmental, non-constrained, non-shamey, and non-guilty sorts of ways. I wish more concepts from philosophy to politics to sociology could be introduced to people through mediums that encourage healthy, emotional respect and exploration, that encourage you to put yourself in the shoes of a character or a being or a culture or a population or an individual who you are not and who you will never be and have no interest in being, but can appreciate the changes of growth or maturity or curiosity that they go through. Frankly, I'm really glad I had romance available to me to help me bridge the gap between the opposing messages that I received about sex and sexuality growing up. I'm really glad that I had it to encourage empathy and understanding for people in different kinds of relationships than the ones that I had. I'm really grateful I've had a genre that has taught me surprisingly healthy ways about experiences I will not have and have no interest in having, in ways that were non-judgmental and were curious and respectful at the same time. I'm glad I had an entire genre of fiction that allowed me to develop a sense of sensuality when my behaviors were constrained for social and cultural reasons that, I was years away from unpacking. I'm glad I had a genre that allowed me to conceptualize sex and sexuality as aggressively positive, because that absolutely helped me in my own sex and sexuality when I did become sexually active. There's a whole other video in here somewhere about the hurdles I still had to overcome, frankly, in unpacking and unpicking the tangles that my upbringing gave me about sex and sexuality. It's work I'm still doing in my late 30s. It's something that, my partner and I have had to confront both as individuals and as a couple. And I'm grateful that romance has given me a lot of language around to do that, because I didn't get it from anywhere else. And ultimately, I'm really glad to see romance kind of coming out of the shadows. I'm glad to live in a time where something like Bridgerton can be popular. Because, again, I spent 15 plus years not even acknowledging that I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of books of a genre, that I was ashamed of it, that I was embarrassed by it. For what? What a garbage emotion to feel for something nobody even cares about. And I really like being the place now where I feel like I can like what I like and I can encourage other people to like it, and that there are communities that celebrate things that are perceived as ultra feminine or silly or frothy. Because when you delve into them, generally shows and books like Bridgerton are dealing with complex human emotions like grief and loss and, the family and love, because romance is about people. I'm glad it's popular now, and I'm glad that I and other people in my friendship groups and communities seem to be feeling less shame about it and less guilt about it. That if you've not given romance a shot thus far, whatever your background, whatever your reasons, maybe give it a try. You might be surprised at the feelings that good fiction unlocks within you. And just because something is genre or gender coded as not for you for whatever reason, be brave enough to be curious and enjoy things that are meant to be enjoyed, I guess.